I'm very happy to be able to introduce Mark Watts from Arup. Mr. Watts joined Arup in 2008 after acting as advisor to Ken Livingstone during his 8 years as Mayor of London. He was described by the London Evening Standard as the intellectual force behind Ken Livingstone and his drive to make London a leading light in the battle against global warming. Mark Watts is now Director of Arup's Energy Consulting Team and Strategic Advisor to the C40 Cities Initiative. Welcome, Mr. Mark Watts.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here. As was said in the introduction, I'm going to talk in two capacities really today. About what makes a sustainable city. First, in my role as a director with Arup, where my main responsibility is working with cities all around the world on their climate change and energy strategic plans and moving those forward to delivery into concrete programs. But also, secondly, a sort of reflection on some of the lessons learned as 8 years working for Mayor Ken Livingstone, who you met earlier, in London. For 4 years, I was his transport advisor, and then for the second 4 years of his term, climate change and environment advisor. And I'm going to try and draw on those two experiences this afternoon. But first, just to say a few words about the firm that I now represent, who may be familiar to some of you, but we don't do a huge amount of work in this part of the world. Slightly strangely, as our founder, Ove Arup, had some Norwegian blood in him, as well as a Danish mother. But we're initially now a relatively large consultancy firm, about 10,000 people spread across 40 countries around the world, 90 or so offices. And we made our name as building engineers, particularly with projects like the Sydney Opera House, where we were the principal building engineers, and still do a lot of that sort of work today. The Beijing Olympic Stadium, lots of the other infrastructure around the Beijing Olympics was the engineering design was done by Arup. But we've branched out into broader infrastructure engineering, so things like the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, the British side of that, very much done by Arup, large bridges all around the world. But now starting to move into more holistic design, and in particular, we've rather ambitiously started a number of projects in China where we are designing entire new cities for the Chinese authorities, doing everything from the master planning right through to the building design, the design of the plumbing infrastructure, the electricity infrastructure, all the way through. So it's very much a multidisciplinary firm, but one that has a big focus on sustainability. And rather unusually, for a very large firm, we have no shareholders. We're a cooperative. We're owned by the staff who work in the firm, and therefore our objectives are set in accordance with what the staff regard as being the biggest issues that they want to work on. And sustainability and climate change has been very consistently one of those over the last few years, which is how we came to be working with this group of cities, the C40, from which I'll draw a lot of the material that I'm going to talk about over the next 45 minutes or so. Ken Livingstone mentioned this organisation this morning. This is a group that he founded when he was Mayor of London. And essentially, it's an attempt to bring together the 40 or so self-styled biggest cities in the world with a broad geographical spread around the issue of climate change, so that they could work with each other, learn from each other, so that each city could move at the pace of the fastest, rather than having to learn everything for themselves in dealing with what was then a fairly new subject for most city organisations when it was set up in 2005. And Arup was appointed as the strategic advisors to the C40 in May 2009, in which we play a variety of roles, but partly giving strategic advice about the direction of the whole organisation to the chairperson of the C40, who as of this week is the Mayor of New York, Mayor Bloomberg, taking over from the Mayor of Toronto, who held the role for 2 years after Ken Livingstone left as the Mayor of London. But then we also work directly in 6 of the cities in the C40, one in each continent where they have members, as well as working for their partners, the Clinton Climate Initiative, on something called climate positive development. So you can see on the map here, the red dots are where all of the member cities are. Those with a green ring around them are where Arup also has offices. So you can see that there's a fairly good spread between those. So in talking about what is a sustainable city, obviously we need some sort of definition. I use a very simplistic definition, but one which I think it stands the sort of test of the key attributes that one needs to consider. And that is a city that in the first instance is able to reduce its carbon footprint down to a level which, if every city had the same, would be manageable for the Earth. So in the context of a developed nation like Norway, that means an 80% reduction in CO2 by 2050. That it reduces its ecological footprint to a level that can be sustained across the whole planet. So we're living off the resources of just one planet, rather than at present in many countries in the world, if every country used the same resources as a place like Norway or Britain, we would need many multiples of the Earth. Someone can correct me on this, but a quick Google search gave a figure of about 6 hectares per capita for Norway, so roughly 5 times what is needed. That feels about right to me. It's a little higher than in the UK. And then thirdly, an increase in the Human Development Index, obviously not necessary in a country like Norway, which already tops the polls for those sorts of characteristics. So they're the 3 characteristics that we use in Arup when we're trying to design new cities. And we very much start our approach by trying to set reasonable targets for a city, for which there is often much criticism. One of the things that's said in the UK is that the one thing that the UK really is a world leader in is setting targets. We're not tremendously good at delivering the targets, but we have amazing targets across a whole array of issues, particularly on climate change. One of the first countries in the world to enshrine in law a reduction in carbon emissions of 80% by 2050 in our Climate Act. But in my view, as someone who's spent most of his career in public service, targets are essential. Anyone, as many of you in the audience here who work in that same environment know, it's almost impossible to move a bureaucracy in any new direction, but to move it in a direction where there isn't a clear rationale, a clear target set politically is even more difficult. When one starts looking, however, around the world at the different starting places of cities, in this case in the context of climate change, which is where I'm going to focus mostly today rather than the broader sustainability agenda, first one sees cities start in very different places, and secondly, they have very different targets. The cities on here are the ones that we're working with most closely in the C40, and you can see here that there's a huge difference between Melbourne, with its very, very high per capita carbon emissions, and Sao Paulo, with its internationally very low emissions. And that whilst there's quite a convergence of the cities in the middle, particularly when you start to look at their targets descending down towards 2020, Melbourne, despite its best efforts, will still be massively more carbon intensive than most of its peers by the time we get to that mark. And that's a big issue for the mayor in Melbourne, that when he turns up at these big international conferences, the record for his city looks so poor. The obvious get-out clause for him is that there's not much he can do about the situation as mayor, because the reason Melbourne's per capita emissions are so high is quite simply that the grid mix that produced the electricity production in Australia is so heavily dependent on quite dirty coal that anything he did in his city would be completely obviated by the emissions produced simply by the use of electricity on the grid. And there's some truth in that, as you can see from the figures here. Indeed, the grid mix in Australia is massively higher than pretty much any country in the world. Norway, I guess, with your very high levels of hydroelectricity, would be pretty close to zero, much like Brazil. However, when you start to dig a little bit deeper in Melbourne, which we did with the mayor and his team, you find that there's some surprising things that come up if you control for the grid mix and even that out against everything else. It's still the case that the average Melburnian uses somewhere between 20 and 30% more energy, more electricity every day than the average for the European Union. And the reason for that is simply the scale of use of highly energy-intensive electrical devices in the home, particularly the huge, great plasma screens, massive fridges, not including cooling systems, which obviously, given the temperature there, do make some difference. And indeed, we found by working with the Mayor that actually the single biggest reason for increase in energy use in Australia over the last 5 years has been simply devices left on standby. The number of new electrical devices that have a standby function that are just left on all the time, even when they're not being used. So when one starts to control down to that sort of level, you can see that actually, whilst the mayors and cities may be relatively impotent in terms of the big energy generation that they can't do much about and isn't really their problem, nevertheless, if you're talking about how people use energy in the home and how people waste energy in terms of things like leaving devices on standby, then there certainly are things that a city government can do if it can engage its citizens and work with them. But I put this slide up, and I'm sorry it's sort of slightly heavy on numbers and complicated, but just to show that even if one gets to that sort of starting point, one can still have rather confusing positions between two apparently identical sets of targets. So this graph here is illustrating the difference between the climate change position taken by Ken Livingstone when he was Mayor of London and Boris Johnson, the current Mayor. And people were very surprised when Boris Johnson took over from Ken Livingstone that he said that he would stick by all the targets that Ken had set on climate change, a 60% reduction in emissions by 2025, way above what's required by the UK government across the rest of Britain. And that was particularly surprising because Boris Johnson very famously had argued in his national newspaper column that he wanted to see George Bush take the Kyoto Protocol Treaty, screw it up and use it for putting practice on the Whitehall lawn. But people thought maybe he'd turned over a new leaf. However, when you start to analyse what it is that he's doing in office, you find that while the 60% target remains, he's changed the way that he's going about it. So for first, he's re-evaluated what he thinks is the business as usual situation in Britain. If he did nothing at all as mayor, what would happen to emissions? Under Ken, we had judged that emissions would continue to rise and actually start to rise relatively substantially because the population keeps increasing. Somehow Boris Johnson has decided that actually business as usual means a relatively steep decline in emissions. So that reduces the amount that he needs to do by about 9.3 million tonnes per year. He's then made a different assessment about what the government is likely to do, far more optimistic about what they will deliver, etc., etc. And so one arrives at two apparently identical targets, but actually, under Ken Livingstone, the mayor committing to deliver about 50% of the reductions that he thought was possible for London using his own powers and budgets and working with business and citizens in the city. Under Boris Johnson, it's more like 25% that the mayor will deliver. The rest is left to the government and others to do so. I think you can't set any kind of generic sort of standard around the world, but from most of the cities that I've worked in, I would say that on general it is possible for a city to achieve, under its own steam, about 50 to 60% reduction in carbon emissions by 2025, 2030 in the developed world, and generally the city government should be able to take responsibility for about half of that reduction total, as long as it can engage business and citizens in a very serious way. That, however, requires quite significant changes in the way that government functions, because climate change has simply not been a problem that local government, city government, or indeed national government has had to deal with until relatively recently. And I think particularly, certainly from my experience in the UK and the US and Australia, most city governments have not traditionally been set up to really think about the long-term development of their city. There's been a general assumption that the best cities kind of evolve in a relatively haphazard way through market and other forces, and what government should concentrate on is the immediate problems of the day. One can't take that attitude with an issue like sustainability and climate change because we just don't have enough time. And therefore, the role of planning of the development of a city comes back to the fore, I think much more like the big role, particularly in the UK at least, of the municipal authorities in the 19th century who brought in proper sanitation, electricity, etc., rather than the national governments.